On October 31st, 1938, a radio broadcast was transmitted across the United States of America claiming that alien life forms from the planet Mars had invaded Earth, causing a widespread panic across the country. Today we explore one of the biggest events in the history of broadcasting, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds.
The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.c. Wells.
Because I was once involved in a variety of interplanetary invasion, people often ask me what I think about flying saucers. Well, truthfully, I don't have any opinion at all. I was rather impressed in reading the other day that a football match in Italy was stopped dead by one of these apparitions. The two teams ceased play and stood staring up into the sky. I think anything that can stop a football match in Italy must be a little bit stronger than an optical illusion. So I say I was rather closely involved with what purported to be an invasion from Mars. I don't know what is in those saucers, whether they're Martians or not, but we once sent some of them to America via the radio in something called the War of the Worlds. I thought you might be interested in hearing something about it. The Martians themselves look something like that. The War of the Worlds was a broadcast we did based on H.G. Wells' story of the invasion of the world by the Martians.
We begin our journey with the man behind the curtain, George Orson Welles, born on May 6, 1915. Growing up, he garnered a passion for performing arts and radio, and wound up with an acting job at the Gate Theatre in Dublin during 1931, after reportedly walking into the building claiming to be a Broadway star. No one believed him, of course, but his passion and confidence at just the age of 16 couldn't be overlooked, so they gave him a job right there and then. As the months went on, he began dabbling in scriptwriting and directing, eventually landing a job on American radio during 1934, working behind the scenes for several shows, sometimes without credits. The money he earned from the radio went towards his own theatre production called the Mercury Theater. The productions put together were some of the best anyone had ever seen.
With 4 hit shows in its first year, the Mercury might well close its door on a season unparalleled in Broadway history. But Mr. Wells has long been working on a project for a greater audience, the Broadways of the entire United States.
The success of the Mercury Theatre garnered the interest of the radio station CBS, who offered Wells his own show which would later be called the Mercury Theatre on the Air. The series would be a weekly show, broadcasting over the summer of 1938, each one being an hour-long adaptation of historical pieces of literature. The episodes all had to be performed live due to radio's strict policy of pre-recordings. The general public had been trained to believe everything on the radio was happening as they heard it, and stations like CBS didn't want to betray viewers' trust, so their preference was to have the show live every week on a Monday at 9 p.m.
The Columbia Network takes pride in presenting Orson Welles in the first production of a unique new summer series by the Mercury Theater on the Air. The director of the Mercury Theater, the star and producer of these programs, Orson Welles.
Good evening. We're starting off tonight with the best story of its kind ever written. It is Bram Stoker's Dracula. I'll see you in Transylvania.
Originally planned to only take place over the summer, CBS gave an extension to the show which would see the series continue into the month of Halloween, where the show would eventually leave its mark in human history.
This Monday night concludes the summer broadcast, which had introduced the Mercury Theater as the first complete theatrical producing company in radio. But the tremendous response which their efforts have drawn from all parts of the country has ensured their continuance with us through the coming months.
The 17th episode of the Mercury Theater on the Air was going to take place on October 30th, 1938. Orson decided he wanted to tackle the renowned piece of fiction War of the Worlds, a story covering an alien invasion from the planet Mars, written by H.c. Wells. His idea was to make this particular episode feel like we were experiencing a real alien invasion across the United States of America. But how exactly could they pull something like that off? Well, Orson came up with an answer. news bulletins.
We interrupt this program for a special news bulletin.
I think because we were criticized a good bit by our sound effects people for dabbling in science fiction, we made a special effort to make our show as realistic as possible. That is, we reproduced all the radio effects, not only sound effects, but, well, we did on the show exactly what would have happened if the world had been invaded. That little music playing and then an announcer coming on and saying, "Excuse me, we interrupt this program to bring you an announcement from Jersey City. Jersey City has just fallen. Take you back to our studio," a little organ music, and then another interruption, and so on. We did all of that very carefully and exactly reproduced, as I say, what would have happened, thinking to make the whole thing more effective.
Bulletin.
An evening of radio programming being interrupted by news bulletins was a very common thing during the 1930s due to so many problems going on throughout the world. The Great Depression had just taken its course, tensions were rising between the US and Japan, the Nazi Party and right-wing radicalism was taking over Europe. Serious events were happening all the time, and radio had the upper hand against newspapers by delivering breaking news to the American public the second it happened, sometimes interrupting the program that was playing at the time. And that's what Orson wanted for War of the Worlds, having numerous pieces of music playing across the first 40 minutes while being interrupted by reports of strange objects landing in several parts of the States. If this was going to work, they needed to be as close to reality as they possibly could make it, without disrupting the story, of course. So, after restructuring the script, they added more news bulletins, more eyewitness accounts, using everything they could at their disposal to make these things much more believable. Even the actors began helping out, suggesting certain rewrites to particular dialogue that didn't come across as natural. They also went from having the alien invasion spanning across several days to having it all happen live, meaning the Martian invasion would take place in just the space of an hour. This is obviously unrealistic for an invasion to happen, but Wells managed to combat that problem by having the program start off at an incredibly slow pace, having the orchestra segments at the start playing longer than most producers recommended him to. In Orson's mind, starting out with a slow pace and having big gaps between the news bulletins would help give the show that realistic atmosphere they were looking for. Then, as the story progresses, the Martians spread across the states. The pace became faster and faster, making people forget about the unrealistic nature of Martians taking control of huge cities in the space of an hour.
The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Wells and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.c. Wells.
On October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles' adaptation of The War of the Worlds was about to broadcast on CBS at 8 p.m. Some people tuning in at the very beginning, excited to listen to a brand new piece of media written and performed live by Orson Welles.
Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theater and star of these broadcasts, Orson Welles.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
The show opens with an introduction to the Mercury Theater, along with a monologue performed by Orson Welles himself. The show begins. Viewers listening, orchestra playing, everything is fine. Until some viewers tuned in a few minutes late. They switched on the radio. They hear that orchestra playing. Oh, must be some kind of performance tonight. We can just leave this playing in the background while we do some chores.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News.
Suddenly the music stops. We're now hearing a news bulletin reporting on a mysterious object that's landed in the States.
It is reported that at 8:50 p.m. a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton.
Reporters are on the scene interviewing experts on what they believe the mysterious object is.
We take you now to Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Carl Phillips again, out at the Wilmot Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. I guess that's it. Yes, I guess that's the thing directly in front of me. But I can see if the object itself doesn't look very much like a meteor. At least not the meteors I've seen. It looks more like a huge cylinder. Has a diameter of...
Now they're listening a little more closely. If these objects are not meteors, then what are they?
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
What do you think? The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Not found on this Earth.
Hearts are starting to pound a little faster now.
See a cylindrical
Just a minute.
shape.
Something's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw in this anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. Some shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. It strikes him head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. The whole field's caught up by the woods, the fires, the gas tanks for the automobiles spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
Losing signal with the reporter after the bizarre object opened up is certainly not what they were expecting.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. Incredible as it may seem, both the observations of science and the evidence of our eyes lead to the inescapable assumption that those strange beings who landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars.
As I was saying, I was listening to the radio, kind of halfway.
Yes, Mr. Willis. And then you saw something.
Well, not first off. I heard something.
And what did you hear?
A hissing sound like this.
He was a teenager at the time. He knew it was a play, but he had some relatives in the town in Pennsylvania that didn't know it was a play, tuned in late like a lot of people did. They thought it was real, and they were in an absolute panic. They called up on the phone, said they were coming over to pick everyone up. They were going to take them in the car and head west, away from the Martians. And he was the one that calmed everyone down, saying, it's just a play, it's just a play, it's just a play, it's not real, it's just a play.
I'm speaking from the roof of Broadcasting Building, New York City. The bells you hear are ringing to warn the people to evacuate the city as Martians approach. Estimated in the last 2 hours, 3 million people have moved out along the roads to the north.
I think quite a few people acted as if Martians really landed. It was a different time. Communication wasn't so good. It was AM radio, so people in a regional area, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania area, could actually hear the program, but they were far enough away that they didn't know what was going on. So quite a few people actually, I think, panicked in some form or fashion.
People start leaving their homes. It's over. There's nothing we can do. People are running for the hills, setting their pets free to fend for themselves. Some even invaded churches, announcing the world is under attack and you might as well go home to die. Others decided to call into their local police stations.
Of course, what Wells was doing, he was just doing a pretend live broadcast.
The battle which took place tonight at Grover Mills has ended in one of the most startling defeats ever suffered by an army in modern times. 7,000 men armed with rifles and machine guns pitted against a single fighting machine of the invaders from Mars. 120 known survivors.
Thinking to make the whole thing more effective, but we had no idea how effective it would be, because about halfway through the show, as we were continuing with the script in front of us, we saw that in the control room there were a great many policemen, and every moment more. Now later we found out that the police were as confused as we were, because there wasn't anything they could arrest us for, but there they were, looking fierce, and a lot of people talking to other people in dumb show, and a very tense atmosphere was generated in the studio. We thought, well, something's gone wrong. Some few people have complained and have swallowed what we're telling them about the Martians having come to the world. But we didn't know that it wasn't a few people. It was, in fact, nationwide. I had no idea that I'd suddenly become a sort of national event.
At 8:32 p.m., CBS supervisor Davidson Taylor received a telephone call in the control room ordering him to interrupt the War of the Worlds broadcast with an announcement that the show was indeed fictional. But by the time the message had gotten across, the damage was already done.
The air that Walter Winchell, who was on a rival network, and had heard about how all the telephone lines had been jammed and all the excitement going on, went on the air on his network, on his program of news commentary, and said, "Mr. and Mrs. America, there is no cause for alarm. America has not fallen. I repeat, America has not fallen." Of course, that was really enough for that network, and by that time there wasn't a phone you could get to.
The following day, the War of the Worlds broadcast was on the front page of every newspaper across the states, claiming widespread panic took place during and after the broadcast. The newspapers reported that thousands of people had called them up along with police stations asking for more information or offering their services to help in the war. There were mobs in the streets of New York, angry and confused as to what they had witnessed on the radio. Reports of people taking their own lives appeared in the news, claiming people were jumping off buildings after hearing the apocalypse had arrived. The entrance of the CBS headquarters was packed to the brim with journalists waiting for Orson Wells to make his appearance and respond to the backlash of his radio show.
I simply don't know. I can't imagine. I mean, you must realize that when I left the broadcast last night, I went into dress rehearsal for a play that's opening in 2 days, and I've had almost no sleep, and I know less about this than you do. I haven't read the papers except
At the time you were giving this role, were you aware that terror was going on throughout the nation?
Oh, no, of course not. We did Dracula, and it seemed to me during Dracula I had high hopes that people would react as they do in a movie of that kind, and I don't know that they did, particularly, and so I've given up. One doesn't believe in the radio audience much. You don't know whether they're listening or not. You have no idea how many people are listening or what they're thinking. I had every hope that the people would be excited as they would be at a melodrama.
According to people who worked with Orson, while he was very apologetic publicly, privately, they could tell he was enjoying this attention. He knew this piece of work was going to go down in history with how huge the backlash appeared. The entire country in a frenzy over something he put together.
Yes. We've asked you that before. Ask it loud, very loud. Do you think, Mr. Wells, that you might have taken unfair advantage of the public in using a method as a conveyance for authentic news?
I don't believe that I have, since it is not a method original with me. It is used by many radio programs. I am terribly shocked by the effect it's had. I do not believe that the method is original with me or peculiar to the Mercury Theater's presentation.
In the days following the broadcast, there was widespread outrage in the media. The program's news bulletin format was described as deceptive by some newspapers and public figures, leading to an outcry against CBS Radio and calls for regulation by the Federal Communications Commission.
Now, this all took place on Halloween, which I think itself should have been a clue for people. But in terms of the initial radio audience, it wasn't huge. However, the ripples travelled far and wide. The news media, when they got hold of this and told the story afterwards, I mean, it was a sensation.
The newspapers went massively over the top because, in many ways, they fell for the hoax more than Wells could have possibly predicted.
There was enormous tension between radio and the newspapers in the 1930s, and radios had essentially won as being the main provider of news for the people. So you had the newspapers trying to negotiate this new role for themselves, and one of the ways they were doing that was using radio's immediacy against itself, saying this is far too emotional a medium, and it whips people up into irrational ideas, and it plays on their worst emotion.
I think the newspapers jumped at the opportunity to vilify radio. Don't forget, radio was a new kid on the block, and it was, to some extent, biting into sort of market share, right? So that, people were committed to listening to it, to getting their news from it, to getting, to some extent, their entertainment from it. So the idea that, radio's done this awful thing needs to be played up by the newspapers, and they're going to milk it for all it's worth.
There was scandal. I think Orson Wells was accused of irresponsibility. How dare he take a revered work of science fiction and play it like this?
the newspapers sort of were very, very willing to sort of lay into what was seen as a scurrilous form of broadcasting, and they went horrendously over the top. In fact, they reacted in many ways more sort of over the top than they would have done had there been a real Martian invasion. And so therefore, but it played straight into Wells's playbook, more than he possibly could have imagined, because it gave him so much publicity.
This was the newspaper's opportunity to stick it to the radio, who were their rivals. You know, that's how it worked for them.
The then 23-year-old Orson Wells became a household name after the broadcast. Many thought it was all actually an extraordinarily well-planned PR stunt. Afterwards, Wells issued a very public apology.
I'm of course surprised that the h.c.wells classic, which is the original for many fantasies about invasions by mythical monsters from the planet Mars, I'm extremely surprised to learn that a story which has become familiar to children through the medium of comic strips and many succeeding novels and adventure stories should have had such an immediate and profound effect upon radio listeners.
By that time, there wasn't a phone you could get to really anywhere in the States. The highways were jammed with cars going one way or another. Those people who were in the cities were going to the hills, and those people who were in the hills were coming into the cities. And if you think this is an exaggeration, it's only a little while ago that I again ran into some workers, some welfare workers, Quakers and Red Cross people who had been up in the Black Hills of Dakota some 5 or 6 weeks after this broadcast, persuading the people to leave the mountains and go back home because the Martians really hadn't come. Now, since this event, during the years that have gone by since then, I've heard a number of stories about things that happened. Some of them may seem hard to believe, but they're all verified. You'll find them in a very scholarly book which Princeton University got out on the subject of mass hysteria. And one of the stories that I like best has to do with the Navy. It's wrong to say that I like it best because, honestly, it does prey on my conscience. The United States Navy, or a great part of it, was in New York Harbor at this time, and the boys, the sailors, were all on shore leave, and they were all recalled that night for active duty. I've often felt very sorry for them, having to give up their nice holidays in order to defend America against the Martians. I've often wondered what it was that the United States Navy ever found to tell the sailors the next morning. And a lot of people didn't know what to do. As a matter of fact, they were phoning us from all over the place, some of them reporting that they'd seen Martians landing in their backyards and asking for advice. And there were others that claimed to have been attacked personally by Martians. The whole experience was extremely intense. And it was I think 4 or 5 years later, I was on the air and I was in the midst of some hymn of praise to the American cornfields or something of the kind, when suddenly a gentleman darted into the radio studio, held up his hand and said, "We interrupt this broadcast to bring you an announcement. Pearl Harbor has just been attacked." Of course, this very serious and terrible news was never believed. Not for hours by anybody in America, because they all said, well, there he goes again, really. Rather bad taste. Was funny once, but not a second time. I suppose we had it coming to us because, in fact, we weren't as innocent as we meant to be when we did the Martian broadcast. We were fed up with the way in which everything that came over this new magic box, the radio, was being swallowed. People, do suspect what they read in the newspapers and what people tell them, but when the radio came, and I suppose now television, anything that came through that new machine was believed. So in a way, our broadcast was an assault on the credibility of that machine. We wanted people to understand that they shouldn't take any opinion predigested, and they shouldn't swallow everything that came through the tap, whether it was radio or not.